I thought weddings were supposed to be happy. I thought family meant I would never be alone. But that night, everything I believed shattered. The room was full of laughter, yet I was invisible. No one noticed I was standing there, quietly. No one called my name. No one saved me from feeling completely alone. I tried to hide it with a smile. I told myself it didn't matter. But the ache in my chest said otherwise. Minutes passed. Then someone leaned close, a stranger, and whispered 4 words that changed everything. Pretend you're with me. Why would a stranger notice me when my own family didn't? Why would they offer comfort without asking for anything in return? I felt a pull I couldn't explain. I followed them, almost without thinking, and suddenly the world shifted. The whispers stopped. The stares shifted. I existed again. But it wasn't magic. It was something deeper, something I hadn't realized about my sister, my family, and myself. What would you do if someone you barely knew became the only person who truly saw you? And what if the people who were supposed to love you most left you completely alone? Stay with me. Because this is not just a story about a wedding. It's about betrayal, invisibility, and a single choice that changed everything. I never imagined a wedding could make someone feel this invisible. But there I was, standing under soft golden lights that were meant to celebrate love, feeling like I had somehow slipped through the cracks of the evening. The music floated through the air, gentle and romantic, while laughter echoed from every corner of the ballroom. People moved in groups, couples held hands, families leaned into one another. And I stood near the entrance pretending I was waiting for someone who never came. I kept adjusting my dress, smoothing imaginary wrinkles, giving polite smiles to people who glanced past me without really seeing me. This was my sister's wedding, a day that was supposed to mean family, togetherness, belonging. Yet the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that I didn't belong anywhere at all. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Weddings are busy, I told myself. People forget small details. I told myself someone would notice me soon, that my sister would look around and realize I wasn't by her side. But minutes passed, and no one came. The quiet realization settled slowly, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wasn't overlooked by accident. I was forgotten on purpose, or worse. I simply wasn't considered important enough to remember. I scanned the room again, hoping to find a familiar face. But everyone seemed wrapped up in their own joy. My parents were busy greeting guests. My sister was surrounded by laughter and flashing cameras. And I felt like a shadow standing just outside the frame. I could feel my throat tighten as old memories surfaced. Moments from childhood when I learned how to stay quiet, how not to take up too much space, how to accept being second without complaining. I had hoped this day would be different. I had believed that family meant something more. As the music grew louder and the celebration deepened, the loneliness became impossible to ignore. I felt exposed, like everyone could see that I was alone, even though no one cared enough to ask why. My heart pounded, not from excitement, but from the painful awareness that this was not just about one night. This was about years of small dismissals finally coming into focus. And just when the ache became almost unbearable, I felt someone step closer. Close enough that I could sense their presence before I heard the calm, quiet voice beside my ear say, "Pretend you're with me." For a moment, I didn't react at all. I stayed frozen, staring ahead as if I hadn't heard him, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just been said. The voice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, steady, almost gentle, and that somehow made it more powerful. I slowly turned my head and saw him standing there, not too close, not invading my space, just close enough to feel like an option rather than an intrusion. His expression wasn't curious or pitying. It was serious in a quiet way, like he had already understood something about me without needing an explanation. I wanted to ask him why. Why he had noticed me when no one else had. Why he cared enough to step in. But the words wouldn't come out. All I could do was nod. A small, uncertain movement that felt heavier than it should have. He offered his arm, not rushing me, not pushing, just waiting. When I placed my hand lightly on his sleeve, a strange sense of relief washed over me, as if my body had been holding its breath for far too long and was finally allowed to exhale. As we took a few steps forward, I became painfully aware of how the room reacted. The glances shifted, the subtle judgment softened. The unspoken question of why I was alone suddenly disappeared. It was unsettling how quickly my worth seemed to change simply because I wasn't standing by myself anymore. The realization stung, but I kept walking, focusing on matching his pace, pretending this was normal, pretending I hadn't been on the verge of breaking just moments before. He didn't rush into conversation. We stood together near the edge of the dance floor, the music swelling around us. Then, in a low voice, he asked if I was okay. Such a simple question, yet it caught me off guard. No one had asked me that all evening. I hesitated before answering, unsure whether to tell the truth or protect myself with a polite lie. I settled for a quiet, "I think so," and he nodded like that was enough for now. We talked about small things at first, nothing that demanded too much emotion. Where we were from, how we knew the couple. He told me he was a friend of the groom, someone who had arrived alone and noticed another person, standing the same way he once had at other events, unsure where to belong. There was no flirtation, no hidden agenda in his tone, just presence. And that alone made the noise in my head finally start to fade. As the conversation continued, I began to feel something unfamiliar settling over me. A sense of calm I hadn't expected to find in the middle of a crowded ballroom. The music still played, glasses still clinked, and laughter still rose and fell around us, but it all felt slightly distant now, like background noise instead of something pressing in on me. He listened without interrupting, without glancing over my shoulder for someone more interesting, and that alone made me more aware of how rarely I was truly heard. I found myself talking more than I planned to, sharing little pieces of myself I usually kept hidden. I told him how weddings always made me feel strange, like they reminded me of things I didn't know how to name. I didn't mention my sister at first, but I didn't have to. Something in my voice must have filled in the gaps, because he didn't push for details. He simply nodded, as if he understood that some stories didn't need to be explained out loud. At one point, the music shifted, and couples moved toward the dance floor. For a brief second, I felt that old panic return, the fear that I would be left standing again, exposed and alone. I tensed without realizing it. He noticed immediately. Without making a big deal out of it, he shifted his position slightly closer, enough to block the open space beside me. Enough to make it clear that I wasn't about to be abandoned again. That small gesture hit me harder than any dramatic promise ever could. As we stood there, I caught sight of my sister across the room. She was laughing, her head thrown back, completely wrapped up in her happiness. Then her eyes flicked in my direction. The smile on her face faltered for just a moment. She saw me standing with him, relaxed, included, and something unreadable passed through her expression. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't concern, it was discomfort, and that realization settled deep in my chest. I understood then that my loneliness had gone unnoticed not because it was invisible, but because it was convenient. As long as I stayed quiet, as long as I stayed alone, everything ran smoothly. Seeing me supported disrupted that unspoken balance. I looked away before the thought could hurt more than it already did. He followed my gaze and asked softly if everything was okay. I hesitated, then gave a small nod. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. But something inside me was changing. Standing there, surrounded by celebration, I realized this night was no longer just about a wedding. It was about seeing the truth clearly for the first time, and once seen, it couldn't be ignored. A little later, when the speeches began and the room grew quieter, my sister finally walked toward me. Each step she took felt heavier than it should have, as if the air between us was thick with things left unsaid. Her smile was polite, practiced, the kind she used when cameras were nearby. She glanced at the man beside me before turning her attention back to me, her eyes searching my face in a way they hadn't all evening. "I didn't know you brought someone," she said, her voice light, almost casual, as if this were a harmless detail she had simply missed. I felt a familiar urge rise inside me, the instinct to apologize, to explain myself, to make her comfortable even at my own expense. For years, that reflex had guided almost every interaction between us. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the calm I had found standing beside a stranger. Maybe it was the quiet realization that I had already spent enough of my life shrinking myself. I met her gaze and answered honestly, "You didn't ask." The words hung between us, heavier than I expected. Her smile tightened, just slightly, and she let out a small laugh that didn't reach her eyes. For a second, I thought she might say something more, something real, an apology, an explanation, anything. But instead, she nodded, murmured something about being busy, and turned back toward her guests as if the conversation had never happened. As she walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions wash over me. There was sadness, of course, a dull ache for what I had hoped our relationship could be. But there was also relief. Saying those 4 words felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying for years. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused her. I had simply told the truth. He didn't comment right away. He didn't ask if I wanted to leave or if I was upset. He just stayed where he was, steady and quiet, giving me space to feel whatever I needed to feel. When he finally spoke, it was only to ask if I wanted some air. I nodded, grateful for the escape. We stepped outside into the cool night, the noise of the reception fading behind us. The silence felt gentle, not empty. I took a deep breath, feeling something inside me loosen, for the first time that evening. I realized then that the pain I felt wasn't just about being ignored at a wedding. It was about being seen clearly and choosing, finally, not to disappear. We stood outside for a while, the cool air brushing against my skin, carrying with it the distant hum of the celebration still happening inside. The contrast was strange. Inside, everything was loud and full and bright. Out here, it was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing again. I hadn't realized how tense my body had been until that moment. My shoulders slowly relaxed, and I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. He leaned against the railing, giving me space, not watching me too closely, not demanding conversation. That felt important. After a few moments, he asked if nights like this were always hard for me. The question was simple, but it opened something I usually kept sealed shut. I told him. Carefully at first, that being around family sometimes made me feel like I was standing on the outside of my own life, looking in. I didn't go into details. I didn't need to. He listened, nodding in a way that showed he wasn't trying to fix anything, just understand it. I admitted that I had expected this wedding to be different. I had thought that showing up, helping, being present would count for something. Saying it out loud made the disappointment feel more real, but also more manageable. It was no longer just a quiet ache buried deep inside me. It had shape now. Words. He told me, gently, that sometimes people get used to the roles we play and stop questioning whether those roles are fair. Hearing that made something click inside my mind. I had spent so long being the accommodating one that everyone, including my own family, assumed I would always be fine, no matter what. The thought was painful, but it also explained so much. After a while, we went back inside. The music felt louder than before, but it didn't overwhelm me the same way. I wasn't scanning the room for a place to belong anymore. I already knew where I stood. I noticed people glancing at me again, curious now, maybe even respectful. It was unsettling how much changed just because I wasn't alone, but instead of shrinking from that realization, I held on to it. For the rest of the evening, he stayed nearby. We didn't dance. We didn't make a show of anything. We just existed in the same space, and for the first time that night, that felt like enough. I wasn't invisible anymore, and I didn't need to beg anyone to see me. As the evening stretched on, I began to notice the subtle changes around me. Conversations that had ignored me before now included me, though not out of obligation. People asked questions, smiled in my direction, and for the first time that night, I felt seen without trying to perform, without forcing myself into a role that wasn't mine. The contrast was startling. All evening, I had moved like a shadow, blending into the background, holding my breath while everyone else shone. Now, simply by being accompanied and present, I felt a shift in the room, as though space had opened up for me that had never been there before. I glanced around and saw my sister again. She had been glowing all night, completely at ease with her guests, yet this time her gaze found me, and I saw something in her expression that I hadn't noticed before, a flicker of uncertainty. Not anger, not sadness, not even surprise exactly, more like a quiet realization that the person she had overlooked was no longer invisible. I turned my attention away quickly, not out of shame, but because I didn't need her acknowledgement to validate my existence. I realized, painfully but clearly, that the night hadn't been about her seeing me. It had been about me finally seeing myself. The man beside me remained a constant presence, silent and steady, like an anchor in a sea that had felt too vast and isolating before. He didn't need to fill the silence with chatter, didn't need to perform some act of heroism. Just being there made the difference. Every small gesture, the way he glanced around to ensure I wasn't being ignored, the careful patience in his demeanor, the subtle support without words, made me feel safe in a way I hadn't expected. It was strange to rely on someone I didn't know, yet so natural, so grounding. At one point, a group of wedding guests approached, offering casual greetings and smiles, and I realized I could respond with a calm, quiet confidence I hadn't felt all night. I laughed genuinely at a joke, answered questions without hesitation, and felt the warmth of social connection return, not forced, but natural. I noticed how quickly people adjusted, as if they had sensed the shift in me, even if they didn't consciously understand it. Later, when the music softened and the slow dances began, he offered his hand with the same quiet respect he had shown all evening. I took it, and we moved to the dance floor, not in a dramatic or romantic gesture, but simply to exist side by side in a space that had once felt too vast, too overwhelming, too unwelcoming. Each step was a quiet rebellion against the years of being overlooked, a subtle claim that I deserved presence, acknowledgement, and care. That night, the wedding ceased to be just a celebration for someone else. It became a testament to the quiet power of being seen and valued, even if only for a fleeting moment. As the night wore on, the ballroom began to empty gradually, the music softening into gentle, familiar strains, and the laughter fading into the background hum of a party winding down. I found myself standing near the edges of the room, watching the last few couples dance, and realizing that for the first time that evening, I wasn't watching from a distance. I belonged somewhere. Not to my sister, not even entirely to this crowd, but to myself. That realization felt both terrifying and liberating. I had spent so many years shrinking to fit the expectations of others that standing in my own presence felt almost rebellious. The man who had first whispered, "Pretend you're with me," remained by my side, a quiet anchor in the fading chaos. He didn't push for conversation, didn't ask for explanations about my family, and didn't attempt to insert himself into my story beyond being there. Yet his presence spoke louder than any words could. I felt seen in a way I had never allowed myself to feel with anyone, even my closest family members. There was no pressure, no expectation, only a simple acknowledgement of my worth as a person who deserved to occupy space and be noticed. Eventually, he suggested we step outside, and I nodded without hesitation. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers from the ceremony and the distant hum of cars leaving the hotel. Stepping out felt like stepping into a different world, one where I could finally exhale without worrying about appearances or obligations. We stood there in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward or empty, but gentle and grounding. A pause that allowed reflection. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice soft, almost tentative, but filled with genuine concern. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, gratitude, and something new. A quiet strength that I hadn't realized I carried. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think I am." We lingered there for a few more moments, sharing nothing and yet communicating everything. There were no promises, no exchanged numbers, no dramatic declarations. Just acknowledgement, human connection, and the simple truth that sometimes, even a stranger can remind you of your worth in ways the people who are supposed to care cannot. When the night ended, and he finally turned to leave, we hugged briefly, a fleeting contact that felt heavier than it should, and then parted ways. Walking back into the quiet streets, I realized that the wedding hadn't broken me. It had shown me what had always been missing. I understood that being alone sometimes hurt less than being invisible, and that small gestures of kindness could illuminate truths hidden beneath years of neglect. That stranger hadn't changed my family or erased the hurt, but he reminded me that presence and attention could heal in ways I hadn't allowed myself to hope for. The night ended, but the lessons it carried stayed with me, quietly reshaping how I viewed myself and the people around me. The next few days were strangely quiet. Life went on around me, but the wedding had left its mark, an invisible line drawn between what I had always accepted and what I was finally unwilling to ignore. My sister never mentioned the night again. My parents never asked if I had enjoyed myself, and the absence of acknowledgement spoke louder than any words could have. I realized that silence had always been their way of protecting comfort. Mine had been invisible, so it was easier for them to ignore. The thought stung at first, but over time, it brought clarity. I didn't need apologies or explanations to validate my feelings. I only needed to recognize the truth for myself. In the following days, I found myself replaying that evening, the moment he whispered those words, the gentle guidance of his presence. It was almost surreal how one stranger, someone I had never met before, could make me feel so recognized and safe, when my own family had failed to do so. I realized then that kindness doesn't have to come from someone familiar to be real. It can appear unexpectedly, quietly, and still leave a lasting impression. That night had been a lesson in seeing and being seen, in recognizing who truly pays attention and who doesn't, and in understanding that my presence mattered, even when others failed to notice it. I started to reflect on the small betrayals that had accumulated over the years. The quiet neglect, the subtle dismissals, the absence of care when I needed it most. For years, I had carried these moments in silence, believing they were my fault or that I needed to shrink to keep peace. Now, I could see them clearly, without bitterness, without drama. They were patterns, not truths about my worth. I had learned something important. Being invisible in a room full of people didn't define me. Being silent to avoid conflict didn't make me less deserving. And most importantly, the smallest gestures of recognition, even from strangers, could restore a sense of self that had been buried for far too long. I realized that the man who had stepped into that chaotic ballroom wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He hadn't fixed my family. He hadn't solved the deep, seated patterns of neglect that had shaped my childhood. But he had reminded me of something far more essential, that my existence mattered, that I could stand in my own truth, that I could be seen without performing, and that moments of genuine connection could heal more deeply than years of empty attention. If this story has moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Comment below and tell me about a time when a small act of kindness reminded you of your worth. Your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard here at Betrayal Uncovered. Because sometimes, the quietest moments reveal the deepest truths. And sometimes, the most unexpected people show us what we've been missing all along.